Look at the size of that thing! Dude, that's not a bear!
I filmed Bigfoot being taken by agents, and I filmed the whole operation. By the time I went to grab my camera, the footage disappeared. But the lengths those agents went to make sure I never talked about it are far worse, and that will tell you exactly how much they are trying to hide about the Sasquatch. My name is Cale Broder. I'm an experienced outdoorsman. I know the Pacific Northwest forests better than most, and have spent decades in terrain that breaks people. It was a remote logging road in late autumn, the kind of place that swallows sound, where mist hangs low enough to obscure the canopy, where cell signal is theoretical on the best days and non-existent on most. I was scouting abandoned trails for a project I still won't specify. I've learned that specificity costs pieces of safety, and I want to tell you the whole architecture of this, even if some rooms stay locked. I've been in woods that felt wrong before, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen, like the trees were positioned specifically to block your view of whatever moved behind them. This wasn't that. This felt occupied, not haunted, not threatening, not even particularly watchful, just occupied. Like walking into a room where someone was working and stopping because you recognized you didn't belong there. The engine trouble started without warning. My truck, maintained obsessively, suddenly sputtered, died, sat silent for 90 seconds, then restarted as if nothing had happened. I checked everything I could check without tools. Nothing wrong. My phone showed full battery, zero signal, in a place where I should have had 2 bars, minimum. I reached for my camera then, not out of excitement. I know the difference between the thrill of discovery and the dread of needing to prove to your future self that you weren't hallucinating. I needed evidence because I already didn't trust what my eyes were receiving. The movement through the trees, I saw size that didn't match any bear I'd ever encountered, speed that didn't match any known animal, a fluidity that suggested something comfortable in that terrain in ways no human could replicate, not a glimpse, a presence, deliberate, aware of me in return. I pressed record. The figure appeared in the first seconds of footage, moving parallel to the road, maybe 60 feet into the tree line, keeping just inside the darkest bands of the mist-filtered light in a way that seemed practiced, not instinctive, not the random movement of an animal threading through undergrowth, but deliberate use of shadow, tracking along the road, aware of the truck, adjusting its position relative to both in a way that suggested not instinct, but decision-making. The size was the first thing that stopped making sense. I have encountered every large animal that lives in those forests, and I have never once misjudged a bear. This was not a bear. The proportions were wrong in too many specific ways for that explanation to survive even a second of scrutiny. The arm length, I can still see it in my memory with a clarity I wish I could transfer into words, suggested a span that would require a body architecture that simply does not exist in any animal I have ever studied. The way it moved carried weight in the wrong places, distributed differently than any quadruped or known biped, the stride covering ground in a way that I kept trying to parse against known gaits and kept failing. It moved through that terrain like it belonged to it completely. Like every root and depression and angled branch was information it had processed long before I arrived. I was whispering into the microphone, not commentary, not narration for any imagined audience. Just words escaping without decision, the sound of a person trying to stay rational against the pull of what they're witnessing. Describing what I was seeing out loud because that was the only way I knew to test whether it was real. Then it stopped. Complete stillness in the way that no animal stops. Not a deceleration, not a weight shift, but a switch thrown. And in the silence of that stop, it turned. The head first, then the body following in a slow rotation that was entirely deliberate, and it looked directly at me. Through the windshield, through the lens. The eyes reflected light differently than anything I have ever filmed. Not the flat mirror flash of deer in headlights, not the greenish return of nocturnal animals. Something warmer and more complex. And behind those eyes, I know how this sounds, there was assessment, not the blank registering of a threat stimulus you see in animals. Something that looked, across the full 10 seconds, we held each other's attention, like the thing behind those eyes was performing an evaluation, taking in information, reaching a conclusion. I held completely still. I think I stopped breathing. The figure looked at me, finished looking, and returned its attention to the forest. The movement communicated as clearly as any gesture I have ever witnessed, that it had seen me, classified me, and decided what to do with that information. The decision appeared to be, continue. I breathed. I kept filming. For several more minutes, the figure moved through the trees in that same measured way, occasionally pausing, occasionally looking back at me with that same evaluating stillness. I kept the camera on it and kept whispering into the microphone and kept trying to make sense of what I was watching. The mist shifted around it as it moved, thickening in some places and thinning in others, and the figure navigated those changes the way you navigate a familiar room in the dark, without hesitation, without recalculating, with the ease of something that had been moving through this specific forest in this specific kind of light for long enough that the fog was just another condition it had learned to use. I was aware, in a way I couldn't fully articulate, that I was watching something go about its morning. That, whatever I had interrupted by turning onto that road, it was still happening, just with me added to the edges of it. That I was a variable it had assessed and filed and moved on from, and the moving on was not indifference, but confidence. It didn't need to watch me because it had already decided I wasn't a threat. I'm not sure, even now, whether that should have reassured me or frightened me more than everything else. The silence was the other thing. Real wilderness is never fully quiet. There are always birds, insects, the creak of trees, the small sounds of things moving through undergrowth. That road had gone completely still from the moment I turned onto it. No birds, nothing. Just the low sound of the truck's engine and my own breathing and the almost imperceptible sound of movement through the trees 60 feet away. The absence of everything else felt deliberate, like the forest itself had cleared out, like whatever was in those trees had a radius of silence that traveled with it. Then I heard the sounds, a distant mechanical rhythm, low and regular, then radio static, not the fuzz of a consumer device, but something structured, bursts at intervals, a specific frequency, and voices briefly at a volume and tone that suggested people trained to communicate efficiently in environments where sound traveled. Short, practiced, the communication of people who had worked together long enough to need very few words. I panned the camera toward the sounds. In doing so, I caught what I had almost missed. Flashlights appearing in the mist to the north, not searching in the loose arcs of someone exploring, moving in lines, in coordination, cutting through the fog with direction and absolute purpose. Then the figures emerged from the tree line. And look, while putting this story together, we went even deeper. There are others, same roads, same teams, same procedure. We documented everything, the cases, the patterns, the names that keep appearing. All of it is compiled in one place. The link is in the description. Dark clothing, nothing reflective, no visible insignia on anything I could make out from my distance and in that light. 4 that I could count in the initial emergence, spaced at intervals that were clearly deliberate, not the casual spread of a group moving through woods together, but an intentional geometric arrangement, each position relative to the others, calculated to cover angles and close corridors. What struck me, watching them move through the mist and into the open ground near the road, was how little they looked at anything directly. Their eyes moved in patterns, scanning arcs, checking positions, reading the tree line, in a way that suggested training rather than curiosity. They weren't looking for the creature, they knew where it was. They were reading the terrain around it, checking for variables, confirming that the situation matched whatever map of it they had built in advance. They moved into their placements, without discussion, without hesitation, each person arriving at a position that had clearly been assigned before any of them set foot on that road. I pressed myself back against my seat. I was certain in that moment that one of them would turn toward my truck, that the camera through the windshield would catch the light and draw attention, that my presence, undisguised and impossible to miss, would interrupt what was unfolding in front of me. None of them looked at me, not once. I kept filming. The creature registered the team before they were fully positioned. I watched it happen in real time through my lens. A change in posture, a raising of the head that picked something from the air and translated it instantly into a different quality of attention. It turned toward the lights, and what I saw in that turn, what I have spent years trying to find words for, was not confusion, not the bewilderment of an animal encountering something outside its experience. It was recognition. The recognition of something that knew specifically what the arrival of organized humans in formation meant, what it had always meant, what was about to happen. It moved faster than anything that size should be capable of, covering ground in a burst that made me revise, in real time, everything I thought I understood about what speed was possible in a creature of that mass. It went for the southern tree line in a straight line, committed and explosive. Two of the figures were already there, not running to intercept, already positioned, before the creature moved, as if they had known which direction it would choose, which gap it would read as the exit, which angle instinct would send it toward, as if that choice was part of a pattern they had observed enough times to predict and plan around. The creature changed direction without slowing. It pivoted with an agility that made the word feel inadequate, and the fourth figure, who I had lost track of during the repositioning, who I hadn't been able to locate in the trees, was already covering that angle too. I understood, watching this unfold, that I was not watching a hunt. I was watching a procedure. What followed was the longest 11 minutes of my life. They deployed equipment I had no names for. Cases that had been carried in now opened into things with no civilian reference point. Components assembled in sequences that suggested regular repetition, handled with the ease of tools so familiar they required no thought. Lines or cables with handheld components, a larger device that required two operators and was partially obscured by both the figures and the thickening mist. Communication in gestures that had their own vocabulary, brief and precise, the shorthand of a team that had built a language together through repetition. The creature fought with everything it had. I need you to understand the scale of what I mean, because the word fight doesn't carry the right weight by itself. When it made first contact with the nearest figure, absorbing something that had been deployed, cables or lines catching and tightening, the force of its response traveled through the ground and through the frame of my truck and into the seat beneath me and into my hands on the camera. A low-frequency shudder, structural, the kind of vibration you feel in your back teeth. Whatever it weighed, whatever force it could generate, I felt it from 60 feet away through 2 tons of vehicle. The team had anticipated this. They distributed the resistance across the group rather than concentrating it, used the equipment in sequences that had clearly been ordered in advance, adapted around the force rather than attempting to meet it directly. They were calm in a way that was more unnerving than aggression would have been. The calm of people who had accounted for this level of resistance in their planning, who had faced it before. The creature changed tactics. I want to be precise about that word, and I stand behind it. Tactics, not just directionless struggle against restraint, but a sequence of attempts that changed when each failed, that tested for openings with evident intelligence behind the testing, that worked through the problem rather than simply reacting to pain. It found a gap in the formation. Briefly, I saw it happen, saw the figures scramble in a way they hadn't scrambled before, saw the momentary collapse of the geometric precision they'd maintained throughout. Something was exchanged between two of them in a tone I hadn't heard yet, carrying a note of controlled urgency beneath the professional flatness. And then the creature drove through that gap with everything it had left. I want to slow down here because this is the moment I have replayed more than any other in the years since, the moment where the outcome felt genuinely uncertain for the first and only time. The two figures who should have been covering that angle were still recovering their positions. I could see them moving, could see the gap between them that was still wide enough, still open. The creature hit that opening at full speed, body low, arms driving, moving with a desperation that was different from anything it had shown in the minutes before. Not tactics anymore, pure commitment. The kind of movement that comes from knowing that this is the last chance and spending everything on it without reservation. I was holding my breath so hard, my vision was starting to narrow at the edges. For 4, maybe 5 seconds, I genuinely thought it was going to make it. The gap was still there. The figures were still a step behind. The tree line was close, 30 feet, maybe less. And if it reached those trees at that speed, in that terrain, I believed with everything I had that nothing on that road was going to catch it. Then the figure I hadn't been tracking, The one I had lost in the repositioning came from the left, not running, already in position, already there, in exactly the place the creature needed to be empty. The formation hadn't collapsed. It had shifted, and the shift had been designed to funnel the escape attempt directly into a position they had already filled. The gap closed. The window was gone. The creature pulled up hard against the reformed line, and the force of the stop shook my truck again from 60 feet away. A second impact through the frame and into my teeth, and whatever hope had briefly existed in those 5 seconds went out like a switch thrown. It had never been close. They had made it look close. I understood that now, in the sudden, terrible clarity of watching the formation reset with total calm. No urgency, no sign that any of it had been in doubt. They had let the gap open. They had allowed the attempt, whether to exhaust it or to learn something from the direction it chose, I don't know. What I know is that the scrambling I had read as their mistake had been part of the procedure too. I kept filming. My hands were shaking worse than they had been before. Then the second device was deployed, the larger one, the two-person operation. I still couldn't see it fully, positioned at the far edge of my visible frame, half obscured by figures and mist. What I could see were its effects, and the effects were gradual in a way that made them harder to watch than something sudden would have been. The creature's movement changed by degrees, slowed, not stopped, not all at once, but drained, like something being drawn down rather than struck down. The force behind each attempt at the restraints diminished, the reach diminished, the speed diminished. What remained, as the figure finally went to the ground, was a process I am not going to be able to describe adequately, and I know that, but I am going to try anyway, because it is the part that has stayed with me longest and most completely. It took a long time, longer than you would expect. The going down was not a collapse. It was a series of smaller losses. Each one resisted, and then surrendered, and then resisted again at the next level, like something that understood exactly what each stage of losing meant and chose to make each one cost as much as possible. Even when the strength was almost gone, it was still making choices. The position of its body, what it braced against, where it directed the last of what it had. It went down the way something goes down when it has decided that surrender is not the same as defeat, that how you lose is the only thing left you can control. I was still filming, camera against the steering wheel, breathing too loud, the counter reading 15 minutes, 15:30, 16. I remember watching that counter and feeling the specific dread of something ending, not the operation, which was clearly concluding with total efficiency, but something larger. The creature going down in those trees was not just a capture, it was a removal. It was the subtraction of something from a world that had contained it, quietly and without anyone's knowledge, for longer than I could calculate, and the people doing the subtracting had done it before, would do it again, and would leave that road exactly as they had found it, with no trace and no record, and nothing to suggest that anything had ever happened there at all, except for 17 minutes on my camera, except for me. They moved the creature toward an opening in the vegetation to the north, an opening I only now fully registered had been made, not natural. Branches cut or bent back, undergrowth cleared, the gap shaped to specific dimensions, prepared before the operation began. Before I turned onto that road, the vehicle waiting inside it had been positioned there in advance, its engine at low idle, its lights directed inward. They knew exactly where they were bringing it. They had measured the space they would need. Every element, the geometric deployment, the equipment sequences, the predicted escape angles, the manufactured gap in the formation, the prepared exit had been thought through somewhere else by someone I would never see, who had looked at a map and a date and said, here and now. It took 4 of them to move it, and even in that condition, it required their full effort. I filmed the last of it from as stable a position as I could manage. The counter read 16 minutes, 16:40, 17. The last figure stepped through the gap in the vegetation. The engine sound deepened briefly and faded, moving away through trees on a route I couldn't see. The radio static cut. The mist settled back into a silence that was just silence now, just forest, just the ordinary sounds of a place returning to itself as if nothing had happened in it. 17 minutes and 4 seconds. I had filmed all of it. I sat for a moment just breathing, letting the silence confirm itself, letting my hands loosen slightly on the camera. What I had was everything. The approach, the formation, the struggle, the near escape that wasn't, the procedure, the removal. 17 minutes of footage that would, I was completely certain, change everything it touched. I set the camera on the passenger seat. I was already building the plan in my head. Drive until pavement, drive until signal, make copies immediately, multiple devices, multiple locations, running through the steps with the focused calm of someone who understands that the window between now and the first backup is the window of maximum vulnerability, that every minute the footage existed in only one place was a minute of unacceptable risk. I reached for the ignition key. I turned back to pick up the camera. The passenger seat was empty. I want you to sit inside that moment with me because I have spent years sitting inside it and I still cannot find the bottom of it. The seat was empty, not the camera on the floor, not slid into the gap beside the console. Empty. I ran my hand under the seat, checked the door pocket, checked everywhere a camera could physically travel from a bus, stationary position in the span of seconds it takes to reach for a key. Nothing. I got out of the truck without deciding to. I checked the ground around the entire vehicle. I opened the rear door. I looked in the bed. I did all of it in a state that wasn't yet panic, because panic requires accepting what the emptiness implied, and I hadn't accepted it yet. I was still in the stage where there was going to be an explanation, where I had set it somewhere else and was misremembering, where objects behaved the way objects behaved. There was no explanation, not one that obeyed the rules I understood. I stood on that road, silent, mist-covered, empty in every direction I could see, and I began, slowly and with great reluctance, to understand the rules I hadn't. They had known I was there from the beginning. I had already absorbed that much. What I hadn't absorbed was its full implication. Not just that they knew, but that the knowledge had been managed, that someone in that operation had been assigned specifically to the witness, not to confront me, not to approach me visibly, not to do anything that would appear in my camera's frame or register as movement at the edge of my vision, just to be close, to wait, positioned near my vehicle for the entire duration of those 11 minutes, through the approach, through the struggle, through the near escape, through all of it, producing no sound, no shadow at the window, no shift of light that would cause me to turn my head. Waiting for the moment, I set the camera down and looked away. I stood beside my truck and went back through every minute of what I had watched, searching for the moment I would have heard something near the vehicle. A footstep on gravel, a change in the way the light fell through the passenger window, the slight give of the truck's suspension under a hand pressed against it, a breath even, just the sound of another person existing in the fog within arm's reach of where I sat. I went back through it, second by second, trying to find the seam, the single moment that should have given it away. Nothing. Not one thing across 11 full minutes. No sound, no movement, no shadow, no vibration. And the longer I stood there reconstructing it, the more complete the nothing became. Not the nothing of absence, but the nothing of someone who had trained for exactly this, who had practiced producing exactly this quality of invisibility, who had stood in exactly this kind of fog beside exactly this kind of vehicle, and waited and been undetectable and known they would be. This was a skill. Someone had spent time developing it specifically for situations like this one. The absence I was trying to find a crack in wasn't accidental. It had been constructed. Less than 10 seconds. That was the window I had given them, the span between setting the camera on the passenger seat and reaching toward the ignition. Someone had waited through 11 minutes of everything that happened on that road. The struggle, the near escape, the going down, all of it. For a 10-second window they were certain would come. That was the confidence they had in how I would behave. That was how completely I had been accounted for before I ever turned onto that road. And they had been right. I got back in the truck. I looked at the empty passenger seat. The mist sat on the tree line where the gap had been, where the vehicle had waited, where the creature had gone. Just trees now, just fog, just a road that had already forgotten what happened on it. I started the engine and I drove, and I did not look in my mirrors. I had 17 minutes. I set the camera down for 10 seconds. They had been waiting for exactly that long.